For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu. This episode was made possible in part by the generous support of the Tyndale House Foundation. For more information, visit tyndale.foundation.
For me, God is a wager on meaning. And by that I mean it's a wager that there was a maestro of the Big Bang. In the beginning, that there was the Word, that there's a loving creator who sustains the world, that for all the darkness, light will prevail, that there's a creation that for all of my tininess, I can in some fashion serve. I think that's the nearest I can get to saying what God is for me.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. We can all probably identify moments of reading when the words just seem to jump or drift off the page. They seem to come alive, resound, they buzz, they animate, they haunt, they console. It's a lovely experience. And in those moments, do those words become our own? What if we were to speak them, rephrase them, riff on them, send them forth for our own purposes, to our own destinations? And what if you did that with the Bible? Well, of course, many have and do and will. From Shakespeare to Marilyn Robinson, from Eugene Peterson to Bono, from Toni Morrison to Kendrick Lamar, we can see how they make the living word their own living words. And oh, how it all just comes back to us, lucky readers. Enter Irish poet Micheal O'Siadhail and his latest collection, Testament. With mountains and oceans of poetry written over the past 45 years, he writes on love, loss, modernity, music, all an experiment of drawing the universal down into the particular and shooting it right back up again. Micheal joined me recently for a conversation about his confession of faith in these latest poems, which manifests just as much as complaint, longing, grief, mourning, and doubt. The text is structured as 150 of his own psalms, followed by a gospel retelling in internal rhyme. And as today is Good Friday, let's begin with a foretaste. Here's Micheal O'Siadhail's depiction of Jesus on the cross. First, two thieves, and immediately followed by legacy.
It's only Luke perceives such difference between the two beside Christ's cross. The others say outdo the mob in taunts. Knows they, before they die, exemplify a world of light and dark between two thieves. One is poking fun. You're God's son, then save all three. The other checks him, saying, can it be you don't fear God when we now by his side hang crucified? We're both so justly sentenced for wrongs done, and here we pay the price. He's not the one to mock or tease, as he has done no harm. Jesus, please remember me when you are glorified. And he replied, today you'll be with me in paradise. When Jesus saw below his mother paired with that disciple, one he loved, there by the cross he had declared his farewell legacy while hung above. Now, woman, here's your son. To him, here's your mother, heirs of love. I'm thirsty, he cried out, to quench his drought. They find a sponge they hold up on a branch of hyssop to his mouth. Then from their sour wine sponge, a bitter sup. It's finished. We are told he bowed his head and gave his spirit up.
Thanks for listening today. Here's my conversation with Micheal O'Siadhail.
Micheal, it is such a pleasure to have you back on For the Life of the World.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me to talk about this new collection of poems that you've been working on, Testament. And I'm very excited to hear about this very personal approach to the Psalms, to the Gospels, and the experiential retelling and reframing and reimagining that you have brought to this collection. But before we get there, because it seems to be so deeply personal, I really wanted to start with the kind of biographical question about your spiritual background. I'm drawing on a question I'm borrowing from Krista Tippett of On Being, but it's deeply relevant, I think. And that's, tell me about the spiritual background of your youth.
Well, I just like to be clear for a start. When you say spiritual background, do you mean my religious background?
It's a worthy distinction. You can interpret that however you like, spiritual or religious.
Well, I mean, let me start with the religious possibly. I mean, I was reared as an Irish Catholic in 50s Ireland, which entailed the family rosary, holy pictures on the wall. I can remember getting them as presents. One of them was the famous Last Supper, which was signed in the back from the person who gave it to me. I think it was my mother. And then I remember my mother praying. She used to pray out loud every day, and she had a whole length of prayers with people she prayed for, something which I find myself doing myself at this stage of my life, but she would do it aloud and tap her fingers. And then, of course, there was the first confession and the first communion and so forth. And there was learning of catechism, which was very much part of my background. I found that terribly, terribly difficult. But yet I'm very grateful to it because it gave you a great vocabulary. Just think of something like the deadly sins: pride, covetousness, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, and sloth. What a vocabulary to get at that age. It was quite extraordinary. And then there was, of course, confirmation. And I was an altar boy in the local church before I went to boarding school. My father came from a diocese which was connected with Donegal, and which had to do with the pilgrimage which was there it was Loch Derg. You stayed there, you fasted going there, you walked on stones during the night, you stayed up all night, you were allowed a little bit of sleep the next day, you didn't eat. I did it once with my father, and then I did it with friends afterwards, twice. So according to the folklore of the time, I go straight to heaven having done Loch Derg pilgrimage 3 times, so I'm guaranteed. So that would, I mean, I don't know if I should distinguish between a religious background and a spiritual background. A spiritual background, would that be music, poetry, and things which move the spirit in that sense? Though, of course, obviously, in that sort of Catholicism, the spirit was also moved. I don't want to deny that in any way.
What do you remember about the shared experience of religion and the question of whether religion might be, in fact, a spiritual aspect of your life?
Well, of course it was spiritual because you believed in the Spirit and you were praying, and you believed in God and so forth. So, but it was a very sacramental experience. We weren't encouraged to read the Bible. It was given to us in the liturgy and doled out in certain ways. I mean, that's all changed since Vatican II, thankfully. I remember going to the parish priest. I had to be interviewed by him, and he was reading his breviary, and he asked me how many psalms there were. And I hadn't a notion. As a Catholic growing up, you wouldn't have a notion how many psalms there were. I looked at where he was in his breviary and made a calculated guess and came up with 200. So it's ironic that I should be writing 150 psalms in this book, Testament. I do read a psalm every day, so it's part of what I do. But back years ago, when I was still, I'm talking about 40 or 45 years ago, there were times when I got very overtired, and I went back to Norway, where I had been a student in 68, 69. I was a student there, but it became my second homeland, and I used to go on a regular basis there to all my friends who were in. And one particular set of friends whom I stayed with, Erik and Vigdis Bjørhovde, that lived about 2 hours north of, by train, or an hour and a half north of Oslo. And I used to rest there. They were very good to me. I used to rest, and I used to walk in the forest, and I would walk up to the top of a hill where the pious aunt of one of their friends had raised a stone with the first verse of Psalm 121. I lift mine eyes to the mountains, wherefore cometh my help. And from the top of that hill, you could see in the distance Jotunheim, which is from the great series of Norwegian mountains. And I remember in the snow just throwing myself on the ground and praying that psalm from the bottom of my heart. Where does your help come from? So I think that psalm was very much with me when I began to write Testament and began to do these 150 psalms of my own. And I'm fascinated by psalms. I'm fascinated that over 3 millennia they have kept they've kept their freshness. People still use them. These Hebrew Psalms are quite extraordinary. And what is it? I've asked myself often, why do they survive? I think it's because they're cries. They're people crying out, and people cry out no matter what. And that made me feel that could I actually write these Psalms? Could I write my own Psalms? Could I talk to God aloud, as we all do, I think. Anybody, even as we know, non-believers do. So that I wanted to see if I could do that, if I could do that in poetry, if I could turn these into poems. And so that was really the motive behind this book, Testament.
Well, in the same way that you confess your own practice of reading a psalm every day, my experience of reading Testament is that it is quite devotional. There's a kind of meditative, liturgical, or sacramental aspect to the poetry. And I think I was reflecting on your title, your choice of calling it Testament. And I wanted to ask you about the choice of the title. But to me, it was a kind of expressive of your own testimony and your own kind of bearing witness, or as you say early on in the text, a kind of coming out of public expression of your love for God. I wanted to ask, about that, like, who is God to you, and, tying it into where we were with your spiritual and religious background, and now in this kind of moment of declaration and witness bearing.
Well, I think the angle of vision in all my work has been there, but it was, I wouldn't say covert, but it wasn't overt, to put it that way. But you asked me the question, who is God? Greater minds than mine have puzzled over this for thousands of years and had been dazzled by whoever God might be. Now, I have, by definition, of course, the very definition, if there is a God, he is undefinable. You can't present a neat package as to who God is. And of course, there's no knockdown proof whether there is or isn't a God. And I've great respect for those people who decide that they don't acknowledge a God. I don't have any disrespect for people like that. But for me, I've got to say, for me, God is a wager on meaning. And by that, I mean, it's a wager that there was a maestro of the Big Bang, that there was in the beginning, that there was a word, there was the word, that there's a loving creator who sustains the world, that for all the darkness, light will prevail, that there's a creation that for all of my tininess, I can in some fashion serve. I think that's the nearest I can get to saying what God is for me.
I think that's a wonderful place to have you do some reading. So why don't we begin by having you recite Psalter 1.
My time ripens, my days mellow. The lauding cello of this being, I bow, freeing up each string to praise, to sing, to glorify the one that I concealed in lines, in hints and signs, yet out of view, now plays for you and hums your name. It wasn't shame that held me back, or any lack of pride in you. It's just I knew enough to fear the zeitgeist's sneer. Too old to care, look how I dare this coming out and talk about our love out loud. So hear how proudly I proclaim my God by name. Uncloseted, things once unsaid my life declares. My words are prayers my being plays. Through you I gaze at all I love.
And there's so much here that sets the tone for this piece, this collection. But I want to begin with, it starts with time. It starts with days. And it seems that throughout the entire piece, the time and temporality is very much on your mind, the years that you have left. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But how does starting with time, starting with your days, and how is that reflected in your thinking currently?
Well, I think one of the deepest things in me is that as for man, like the grass, he flourishes like a flower of the field. The wind blows over it and it's gone, and its place remembers it not. Those lines, if you've ever thought about them or read them, they leave an indelible mark on you. And we're tiny, we're infinitesimal in the greater scheme of things. And I think I've always been conscious of it. My mother was ill for most of my life. She died at 52. She died quite young, but she was ill through all my childhood. So I think that marked me to a large extent with the consciousness of finitude, the consciousness of mortality. I also had an illness as a boy, which also left me time to think, which I think also was to leave its trace in me in terms of being tremendously conscious of the brevity of our sojourn here on the planet. So, but obviously there's an added dimension to it. I'm now 75. I've had my 70, and thanks to medical science and so forth, I think the Bible's 70 may be upped a little bit for some of us, but I have lost a lot of contemporary friends. I have a friend at the moment who is very ill and probably facing her end, so that I can't but be conscious of time and days.
There's also this strain of both not speaking and speaking. So things once unsaid, my life declares.
Well, I suppose what I mean by that, in Testament, I have deliberately spoken outrightly to God. And as I hint at it, I mean, I've always been a mainstream poet. That's to say, I was thought of as a poet, not as a particularly devotional poet, which I wasn't. And that's part of the zeitgeist. I wanted to be taken seriously, but I also wanted to, I think, in almost to influence people by my angle of vision, as I've called it, without doing this very obviously. But now I think at this stage of my life, what should I care? I mean, I've published all my life. I think I'm accepted as a poet and in the mainstream. So, well, there are examples that went before me. Think of John Donne, for instance, who wrote the most sensual love poetry possible and ended up with very devotional poetry. And all of them, wonderful.
It's interesting to think about that in light of this last line, through you, I gaze at all I love. And I think the way that reads to me is that even if you hadn't been so overt in this collection, it's interesting to think about how the sort of appreciation of beauty around us, the kind of work that poets or musicians, or really, I mean, you could extend this to anyone with a vocation or anyone with loves and interests and something to behold and something to be grateful for, maybe. It's a wonderful visual metaphor that you've got here of gazing through God at all the things that we love.
Yes, what I also think when you were asking me who is God for me, what I didn't say and possibly should have is that this God remains unseen. It was always the tradition, isn't it, of that you couldn't see God and live. But I think sometimes I do see God in people around me, in people I love. I get glimpses. I think we're allowed glimpse through loving people and seeing people. And of course, vocations, as you also mentioned.
How about we move on to Psalter 46? There's some connections here that I wanted to try to tease out.
Nude and weak, I left the womb behind. Past my peak, will I grow feeble yet? God, you frame my life, so I depend from my birth to end on others' aid. Though a pride pretends to walk alone, I admit how all my life depends on friends. I would die in black holes of the self. I'm only I in the light of those I love. Is dependency your plan in case I form a carapace to hide within? In my reliance, you are coring me, hollowing me out to love you more.
This is a really standout for me personally for a variety of reasons, but more days are numbered kinds of talk here, but also dependency and really emergence. That dependency really emerges both on the social dimensions, but also the spiritual dimension or theological dimension of God framing a life for dependence, God coring us out, hollowing us out for the sake of deeper and greater love. But then I'm also noticing like the carapace, a word that I was unfamiliar with, and it's always delightful there, but a shell or something to hide in. So help us understand what's going on here a little bit more?
I think it's the quality of our Western society is this individualism, this sense that I'm myself and I'm independent. I don't depend on anybody. It's a very Western thought in many ways, I think. Certainly it has been brought to greater heights in Western culture. And the truth is, we come in crying at this, and we often will leave crying. And in between, we are dependent to be ourselves. We are ourselves only, I think, in relationship to others. And this idea that somehow or other there's a pure self, I don't believe in. I think it's this relationship which allows us to be who we are. But you mentioned carapace. I mean, what I mean, the temptation is in our society to be a shell. I don't need help. I can put this around me. But I think somehow or other, the way life has been designed for us, we are dependent, utterly dependent from beginning to end. But it takes a certain courage, I think, to admit it.
I mean, coming out of our shells, the question of vulnerability seems to be constantly for us. I see it in my relationships. I think I think more and more there's the urge to go into that shell, hide a little bit more from others, not share one's true feelings or true thoughts and beliefs, but our communities are worse for it. Our friendships are worse for it. And we ourselves are probably worse for it. And there you go from not just a shell, but a black hole of the self. And that sounds like an incredibly lonely, threatening feeling.
Oh, absolutely. Without vulnerability, there's no friendship, there's no love. Somebody has to, in a friendship, intimate at some point, you are important to me. I depend on you. I need your friendship. I need your love. And without somebody initiating that, there is never friendship, not to mention love. So it is a thing. This dependency thing is I think it is one theme in Testament.
Insofar as this is a personal cry, what are you worried about hiding from here?
I think I have gone beyond hiding, quite frankly. I think at 75, I don't hide. I think I fairly allow myself to be fairly vulnerable. And I've been very lucky. I've been very blessed in having love in my life and trust.
And I see now, even rereading this, the dependency here seems to be that backup plan, just in case we're tempted to hide in those shells or even worse, in a black hole that we can't escape from.
Yes, it's as if God had designed it that way.
Tell me more about hollowing out. The reference I was sensing here was, and probably informed by some recent reading of Simone Weil, that French early 20th century.
I know, I have.
Mystic.
Yes, I've read her, yes.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask about this kind of coring or hollowing. It was just such a beautiful but also visceral kind of movement that's happening in that final stanza here, that hollowing out. Such a radical humility. Tell me more about that, like what humility means to you.
It's almost, I think, as if I feel that the depths of joy which you can experience depend on the depths of yourself, how deeply you have been poured out, and you're poured out often by suffering. So there is a correlation to an extent, I think, of what you've suffered with the depth of the joy you can experience. So I think that's how I would think of it. I mean, losing someone you love deepens you for an even greater love. It's quite extraordinary how that works, this hollowing out, as I call it.
I think the right place to move here is honestly Psalter 80, if you don't mind reading from this one.
I cry for all who left too soon. I weep for those who had to die. And you, the one who stretched the sky, I ask you why your canopy and weather eye protected me when some were stranded high and dry. You mystify me, God. How come you pass me by when taking them? And so I wait on your reply, as again I ask you why. Oh, don't ignore my question, please. I adore you, God, but even so, I implore you, tell me why. All those with hopes they still lived for, all those with dreamscapes to explore, all those who had much more to give, all those who still had years to soar, all those who died before they bloomed, all those too young for death's swing door, all had to leave the earth's clay floor. My God, I sigh although I praise, I groan and magnify at once. I tie such bonds with loving friends, yet one by one they say goodbye. I shy away from blaming you, your business, not mine to pry. Unless you try through them to show, to teach me how I best should die. They deserved more life than I, but you, not I, stretched out the sky.
This is just a really heart-wrenching one. You can sense the mourning in it, the questioning of it, and the kind of personal grief in the poem and the experience that would have informed the poem.
Oh, yes. If you've lost people you love, it goes very deep. And there is almost that question which even Holocaust survivors asked, why me? Why was I spared when other people went, other people died? But it's also, I think, in Testament while I don't use the Hebrew Psalm parallelism, which is a very distinct feature of Hebrew Psalms, I don't use it. I use internal rhymes and I use patterns of metrical design, which is different. But I think I like to feel resonates with the Hebrew Psalms is the fact that I complain, I grumble, I ask God, why are you doing this? Which is very much, I think, in the tradition of the original Psalms. But the interesting thing is, behind the complaint, behind the groan, behind the grumble, behind the doubts, there's never any question but the belief that God is there and listening.
The groan and the magnify at once.
Yes, exactly. You can both groan and magnify at once.
To be fair to the human experience, the complications and the cacophony that can be a part of that. It's kind of like it's a wild truth, if that's true, that the groaning is a magnification. It's a very mystical and mysterious thing for that to be true, in my experience.
It is the trust of love, after all. Most people only groan to those they love.
A related poem for me here is actually it's Psalm 80. I feel like it does speak further to God's wild being, the kind of unpredictable nature of God. I wonder if you would read that as well. And this is another example, and I think of the kind of unedited complaint, the unedited groaning, which can somehow stand consistent, if not in some kind of cacophony or some kind of chaos, maybe a jazz kind of chaos, though.
Why does your night thief keep ambushing me, or lurking quietly in the long grass wait, sneak up on me to whisk away a friend? Who says it's time for them to meet their end? No rhyme or reason how you fix the date, a random day, or chosen by decree? As one by one their numbers up? And why not me? Instead, another one? Please tell me this is not a mere caprice, a cruel whim deciding who'll decease, declaring all the days of life now run. You drain your psalmist's overflowing cup. I ask, and yet you don't reply. Why don't you answer now my plea, as half in anger, half in broken prayer, I'm crying out to you in my despair? Why do you keep on doing this to me? And still I'm yours in all my asking why.
This really speaks to me of that tandem psychology or consciousness of both complaint and reliance or dependence and an acceptance of both. And I think what often happens is you err on one side or the other. You err on the side of complaint, and that leads to doubt, and it leads to a kind of well, it's a kind of a threat to meaning, or you err on the side of magnification to the exclusion of complaint, to the exclusion of the groaning. And when we exclude that groaning, we're just stuffing those emotions down in a way that doesn't give truth to the human experience, or truth to the feelings that are very fierce.
Life consists of light and dark. I mean, part of my wager on meaning, which is evident here in Testament, is, that I do gamble on God. But that is not to say that there is not a lot of dark along the way, a lot of suffering along the way. But my belief is that in the end, light will triumph.
Indeed. Both Psalter 8 and Psalter 80 here just continue to express to me God's wild being, the unpredictable nature of God. And this draws me back into a theme that you seem to riff in quite a bit of your work, a theme around Madam Jazz. And one of the things that I noticed about Testament is Madam Jazz only appears in your reframing of the Psalms. It doesn't appear in Gospel. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the tradition of Madam Jazz for you, which is, I think, originating in the five quintets. Is that correct?
It's much earlier, in fact, in my work.
Oh, really? Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how that's showing up here with the kind of wild, unpredictable, improvisational nature of God and Madam Jazz.
Well, I've always been fascinated by jazz in the sense, first of all, we were talking about joy and exuberance coming out of suffering. It's a music which came out of one of the most awful episodes of our human history, slavery. I mean, that's the origin of where that music comes from. And it's quite a phenomenon because, for instance, in the Stetlik in Eastern Europe, you had this extraordinary klezmer music, which again came out of a lot of suffering, or even Cayley music in Ireland, which has the famine in the background somewhere, which is this extraordinary sort of hard-won exuberance, if to put it that way. So jazz always fascinated me in that way. But what I think is the most extraordinary thing for me, it expresses for me the spirit of a God of surprises. There's always more, there's always abundance, there's always the unexpected. And that, I think, but also what a fascinating thought about it too is that it's not simply order or disorder, but an evolving order, as we are all part of this riffing on this creation, which although as a boy you'll kind of learn that God created the world, it all happened once. It still goes on happening, and we're all part of this riffing in our own particular way on the jazz of creation. It's also, I think, improvisation is a huge thought, because I've just been rereading my great friend David Ford, the theologian's new commentary on John, a theological commentary on John's Gospel. And he's very big on improvisation, that that John is encouraging us to improvise on themes. So it is life, if you like, the drama of our lives is one great improvisation. And jazz seems to me to capture that.
I love that. And actually, a connection I'm making right now is, I wanted to test this out with you, is that, and here I would be moving a little bit into the very environmental nature of the context, perhaps, or the kind of the environment. I mean, like the setting of Testament. That kind of riffing speaks to the stewarding in the creation mandate that comes to humanity in no uncertain terms to care for our world, such that if we were in fact riffing and improvising well, then we would be executing such care. And yet it's clear across several of your poems in the piece that there's a particular message about our human environment, the physical, our planetary home and our materiality, but it's not good riffing. We have a kind of errant stewardship. I want to ask you about the environmental message of Testament.
Yes, well, I think one of the ways in which, again, I would like to think that Testament resonates with the original Hebrew Psalms is this recurrence of themes. They don't occur in sequence, but here and there suddenly they impinge again. And one of those themes is obviously in the environment, and it's one that is very obvious in the world we're living in, and very obviously to me connected with the idea of creation and how we're treating it. So that become victims of our own technology, of our own ability to control. And I think our control is out of control, the way which is damaging us. Now, there are obviously, there are the deniers of climate change, the deniers of the damage we're doing to the environment, even intellectual ones. I mean, some are people who maintain that this is, and with science or some sort of science to back, they try to say that I think that there have been eras like this prior to this when the climate has gone to the bad. But I'm inclined to go with them, and of course they blame the media, but I'm inclined to go with the general consensus that we are doing tremendous damage. And I think we need to relearn humility. There is it's an interesting, there's an Earth Bible, which I came across in David Ford's commentary by a theologian called Mary Daly Denton, this Earth Bible. And I think it's Jesus as the gardener, I think is the essential thought in it.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a lot to learn from her.
I mean, that's not the only thematic or methodological connection that I'm seeing in the Psalms. It's not just that different themes crop up at different moments. It's that I see this as one of those enemies. We have these very difficult Psalms of imprecation, the imprecatory Psalms that are calling for justice, for flames to be heaped upon the enemies of the psalmist. And I sense an anger in those moments. I sense a kind of calling out of the enemy of the earth as an enemy of God.
Well, I mean, I think that is so. What can I say except that I do think that our arrogance is, and I think to put it in practical terms, in our age, it's greed and convenience are the great sins. We're prepared to do anything for greed and convenience. And unless we have some, I think, way of thinking that transcends that, we're in serious trouble. By times I speak as I, by times as we. But you, my God, will know exactly why, know how I know I entered with a cry, and will as likely end as I began. But in heaven we are dependent too. We're living in each other's light and shade, and so I have become myself amidst all friends and loves, allowing me be me. Yet I've no use for false humility. I know my gift, but am no egoist. In every word I've spoken, I have prayed. I am in others' service, here for you. One tiny life, yet in your love I span, all in your world now sighing in my sigh. Humanity cries out, though I say I cry for us in my intensity.
This is beautiful, and I just have to say, it really quickened in me T.S. Eliot from the end of the four quartets in East Poker. Really one of the verses that I think has been most meaningful to me, I'd say over the last 2 decades or so. This question, I was going to read it from four quartets. Old men ought to be explorers. Here and there does not matter. We must be still and still moving into another intensity. For a further union, a deeper communion, through the dark, cold, and empty desolation, the wave cry, the wind cry, the vast waters of the petrel and the porpoise. In my end is my beginning. And it was the word intensity that drew this out. I cry for us in my intensity, you say. And I wanted to ask if that was a connection for you, or if I'm reading into that too much. Or
I mean, it's a lovely connection, but it wasn't a conscious connection on my part. Let me put it that way. I think one of the quotes from Eliot, which speaks tremendously always to, I think, our culture, and particularly, I mean, when I think it was in Bert Norton, but the phrase is distracted by distraction from distraction. And oh my gosh, if that was the case in 1936, what is it now when you can't get away from pings? And when the avowed intention of the priests of the internet is to hold our attention as much of the time as possible. So that's the Eliot phrase that sort of haunted me in thinking about our contemporary culture and when writing Testament. But no, I suppose what I'm thinking here is that have used the word I the whole time in the Psalms. It's a conversation between me and God. Does that mean simply I'm an egoist, that it's just me and God? I was talking to a friend of mine in Ireland who since has died, and I sent him a copy of the Psalms before it was ever printed, as I knew he wasn't going to last too long and he wanted to read them. And I said to him, jokingly to him, I said, do you think when Testament comes out, I'll be classified as some sort of a holy Joe or something? And he laughed and he said, no, I don't think that. He said, but they'll think you have a big eye. So I hope, like the original Psalms, that the speaker, the psalmist, and after all, there were many of them because they're written over 500 years, they reckon, the Psalms. So there were many eyes involved. But I think they can stand for we. And that's what I'm trying to say. I think that going deeply into yourself, you also speak for all of humanity.
And it's certainly consistent with the message of dependency, or the relationality that leads to self. And I'd say poetry is one of those mediums that is perhaps more able to do such a thing because of the kind of universal down into the particular, right? As I read your words and this poetry, it lands on me in a particular way, right? It reminded me of T.S. Eliot in this case. But that's a heavy load to bear. And I wonder if you'd reflect a little bit about, do you take that kind of speaking for the kind of the poet as witness, or poet as maybe even prophetic witness? How does that land to you? Is it a burden? Is it freeing?
Well, I in my personal life, I've taken it very seriously insofar as I have now, I think, been 35 or 36 years full time as a poet. And that's a huge privilege. I get up every morning and give thanks for it. I start my morning always with that wonderful Jewish prayer, modernity, which I like to pray in Hebrew, which you're supposed to, the first time your consciousness hits you in the morning, you come with it, and thankful am I. So that I'm grateful every day that I have this huge privilege of being able to, one, do what I love, but also serve in this fashion which seemed to me to be what I was called to do. But I've taken it very seriously, and so far as I try, both in personal and in more public themes, to speak out and to speak for humanity. That may sound like arrogance. I hope it doesn't, but it certainly, I try to use my privilege as best I can.
I wonder if maybe that was the whole of it, but would you mind reciting that Jewish prayer in Hebrew?
Do you mean in Hebrew or in translation?
Both, if you don't mind. I think that would be a beautiful thing to share.
I hasten to say that if I recite this for Jewish friends, they always say it's wonderful to hear with an Irish accent. So God alone knows how my pronunciation is. Modeni lefanicha, melechai v'chayam, she hechersezer zerta, nishmati bi, becha la rabba emunuteka. I'm sure that's a very Irish pronunciation of Hebrew, but after all, a Dubliner was once the president of Israel, so they've heard it before. The standard translation of it is, I thank you, living and eternal King, for returning my soul within me in compassion. Great is your faithfulness. And the Jewish tradition is that the first time your consciousness hits you after sleep, that you pray that prayer. I'm afraid I'm a bit human. Sometimes it doesn't happen till I get to the shower.
Yeah. So I would like to move toward gospel. But the fact is, I just have to confess, I was just very deeply moved by what you were doing throughout the Psalter and these 150 poems that was there. And it kind of takes up the lion's share of your work. And I wanted to ask about the connection here between Psalter and gospel in this piece. You can imagine just sticking with the Psalms. You can imagine just producing something that's just called gospel, right? But tell us a little bit about the connection between the two.
Well, I suppose one could say that the part which I've called Psalter in Testament, that's to say these Psalms of mine, they address of God in a more generic fashion, perhaps. In other words, I would hope that the conversation would be open to anybody who was a believer. Obviously, gospel.
I mean, the word universal came to mind. It was
that would be my desire.
Yeah.
But the gospel one then takes my particular tradition, which is the Christian tradition, which I was reared in. And but if you think in, and this is, of course, a Christian thought, but if you think in Trinitarian terms, the Psalms in Testament are more about God and the Spirit, whereas the Gospel is about the Son, Jesus Christ, so that it's incarnational in that way.
Yeah. It's so much more particular, and that's the way it reads. We go from a kind of mystical poetry, but deeply personal. It's still deeply particularized. It's still able to speak from a kind of ordinary human life. And I think that was beautiful. But there is a specific kind of particularizing as you move into gospel and move into the particularity of Christ's incarnation.
Absolutely. And I also move out of it at that stage as well and leave it. I don't really comment on the stories, or very little. I have gone for going for the plain sense, as it's called, I think, by theologians, and to let the story tell itself. And as I was doing them, I remember saying to my wife, Christina, I said to her, what am I doing here, I wonder, really, with these? And she made the wonderful statement to me. She said, just think of those wonderful paintings of the Annunciation and so forth, how they bring you back to the text and think of, that's what you're doing in a sense. You are retelling the story in a way that revitalizes it and perhaps brings it back to people to go back to the original story. For me too, on a personal level, it was a great experience because I've known all these stories since I was a boy. But I wonder, did I really appropriate them ever before in the same fashion as thinking on them, meditating on them in the way I did when I was writing the gospel part of Testament?
I mean, the way that you even just explain that right now about your voice with the I disappearing in gospel, it's as if, the movement there is as if God has answered that prayer of the pouring out, of the hollowing out. And then the succession is one of that particular gospel story, which is good news and tells its own story and is organized though. So I wanted to ask about like the particular choice of organization that you bring to it, these moments that you chose to hone in on as opposed to others, and tell us a little bit about the kind of the filter that you used or that you felt was happening as you were identifying the gospel moments that you would represent here in verse.
I think this is where the personal gets into it. It's the ones that I reacted very much to and that affected me and which brought back memories of hearing them always as growing up, but suddenly at my present age, suddenly lit up for me. And I just wanted to hold them up and say, look at this moment. I took the ones, for instance, one that I took was the two thieves. And that's one which is always, it recently occurred in a lectionary, which I follow. And I actually cried after reading it. There's something so extraordinary about that final, be with me today and you'll with me today in paradise. It's just quite extraordinary. And if I may be a little anecdotal, had to do with this. I was dealing with a care home, and I had been dealing with one which was run by lay people who were simply wanting to make money. It was a business. And then I was subsequently dealing with one where there were nuns. And it was quite extraordinary. There was a difference in the ethos, but how do you define an ethos? How do you put your finger on an ethos? And the best I could do was remember coming out of Mass on one occasion where that two thieves had been part of the gospel. And this old nun who was walking with a walker, and she turned to me and she said, "Isn't it amazing how one of them saw it and the other didn't?" And then she went off again. And just that comment to hear that comment in the home with a completely different ethos. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how a comment spoken by the right person at the right time lands completely differently. I would love to have you read your telling of Two Thieves.
It's only Luke perceives such difference between the two beside Christ's cross. The others say, outdo the mob in taunts. Knows they, before they die, exemplify a world of light and dark between two thieves. One is poking fun. You're God's son, then save all three. The other checks him, saying, can it be you don't fear God when we, now by his side, hang crucified? We're both so justly sentenced for wrongs done, and here we pay the price. He's not the one to mock or tease, as he has done no harm. Jesus, please remember me when you are glorified. And he replied, today you'll be with me in paradise.
Yeah, that's deeply moving and is expressive of the kind of groaning and magnification. I think of the kind of suffering that this form of capital punishment presents and the kind of just like physical raw pain of it. And I can certainly see myself with that kind of utilitarian faith of the first thief, demanding that he be saved. And yet that humble faith of the second thief, that is that corrective there, is a thing to behold. And it's it's a strong check to the ego. It's a strong check to the feeling of dependence there. And again, you're just holding that light and dark. And there's this world that you described between the two thieves. It's incredible.
Oh, yes. And I that was written subsequent to that nun's remark. And I always remembered it and was grateful, so grateful for that ethos.
Yeah. The very next poem in sequence is called Legacy. I wonder if you'd read that.
When Jesus saw below his mother paired with that disciple, one he loved, there by the cross he had declared his farewell legacy while hung above. Now, woman, here's your son. To him, here's your mother. Heirs of love. I'm thirsty, he cried out, to quench his drought. They find a sponge they hold up on a branch of hyssop to his mouth. Then from their sour wine sponge, a bitter sup. It's finished. We are told he bowed his head and gave his spirit up.
Another just, I just need to remark on your ability to pull these in and organize them into an orderly fashion that communicates the complexities there, kind of following the parameters of verse and rhyme schemes and meter, and yet kind of opening up little universes in each verse. If that is a fitting pun.
Well, thank you.
It's the word legacy, though, that really is coming out here, both the title of this poem as well as the word in his farewell legacy while hung above. I need to reference one of your poems from the Psalter in Psalm 16. You write, quote, "Grant me my career's remaining dream, years to leave love's legacy behind." And in light of this poem that you just recited, what does this very profound Greek word tetelestai, so you translated "it's finished"? What does that word tetelestai mean for you in light of legacy? And how do you speak to, in this instance, that kind of calling, the finishing of one's calling and the finishing of one's legacy at a human level, at a personal level? I just want to ask you, what will your love's legacy be?
Well, I hope that the people I have loved, the people whom I have been with, that passes on. I think that love is infinite. It passes from one to the next and so forth. So that is part, I think, of the legacy. But if I was to think that wonderful phrase that was used by Dylan Thomas when he wrote that for all their, I forget the complete quotation, but something like, for all their crudities, for all their doubts, that his poems were written out of love of man and in praise of God. Well, I think if I was to choose an epitaph from my own attempts to master poetry, I think my epitaph might be, it would be this, I think. Whatever I become or am or was, I loved my friends. I praised my mistress Jazz.
Micheal, thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like this is a beautiful place to end. I hope for my part that a similar epitaph might be there. Of course, each of us in some sense is already writing our own. So thanks so much for opening up in this volume of poems and opening up to me here.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to talk.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured poet Micheal O'Siadhail. Production assistance by Macy Bridge, Logan Ledman, and Kaylin Young. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu, where you can find past episodes, articles, books, and other educational resources that help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. If you're new to the show, remember to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. And to our loyal supporters and faithful listeners, we've got a humble request, and that's to tell a friend or share an episode. Here's some ideas. First, you could hit the share button for this episode right here and send a text or an email to a friend, or share it to your social feed. Second, you could give us an honest rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. How are we doing? Finally, you could write a short review of the show. Reviews are cool because it'll help like-minded people get an idea for what we're all about, in your own words, what's meaningful to you, our listeners. Well, thanks for listening today, friends. We'll be back with more soon.